We'll be reading from the Gospel of John this morning. We'll be taking a look at chapter 20, verses 19 through 23. As we turn to Scripture, to the Word, let us turn to God in prayer. God, we come to you in prayer asking that you help center us on the now, that your Spirit fill our hearts, that we make wide the gates for you to come in and change our lives through your word. May we forget the things that we did or left undone last week or the plans we have this week and center ourselves right here and now in these moments. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. And again Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Just a note, the main preaching text this morning will be on that of Genesis, of what Tim read. Gotta figure out how I'm going to do this. Because I don't do a good voice. I'll just say, why are there so many songs about rainbows? And what's on the other side? Now you know where I could have gone there, right? Because that question was first raised by none other than Kermit the Frog. Sitting on a log in his swamp, a beautiful swamp, enjoying the day, plucking his banjo. Way back in 1979, he did that. Sitting alone, he was enjoying his home right up until a Hollywood agent in a canoe came by, looking for the next thing, and he found him. He found this frog singing with the banjo, and the rest of the story is history, as they say, or really the rest of the story is the Muppet movie. Someday we'll find it, the rainbow connection, the lovers, the dreamers, and me. That's what he's saying on his log. Yeah, some weeks sermon planning, it has you buried in studying hard the theological undertones of none other than Kermit the Frog. And that's where I found myself this week. Sometimes it leads you to watching clips of the Muppet movie on YouTube, which can be a Pandora's box if you're not careful. Seeking inspiration, looking to find that rainbow connection. I was reminded again as I was deep in my theological studies that one of the classic lines of cinema, all of cinema, I think come as Kermit and Fozzie Bear pull up to this countryside church. And they crack open the doors because they hear this music coming from inside. They crack open the doors and they see none other than Dr. Teeth and the Electric Mayhem jamming out on the chancel area up here, right? And Fozzie looks at Kermit, and Kermit looks at Fozzie, and Fozzie says, "They don't look like Presbyterians to me." No, they don't, Fozzie Bear, do they? That was just another step for Kermit and Fozzie on the journey. Someday we'll find it, the rainbow connection, the lovers, the dreamers, and me. You and I do have a rainbow connection. And some of us have forgotten, I think, our rainbow connection. It's there, and it's magical to see when the moment is just right, this rainbow. We just have to look to find it again, I think, sometimes. And we will find it. We will find it, and we will celebrate our own rainbow connection today as we celebrate the sacrament of baptism. The sign and the seal and the covenant, the covenantal love of God, present in rainbow, present in water. The story of Noah and the ark is one of the most ancient and timeless stories on this earth, whether you're a person of faith or not. You know it. It is a story of creation, it's a story of humanity, and it's a story of the Creator God. I invite you in the story to go further still, though, with what you think you know, what you remember, to find the connection in that story between you and God, the rainbow connection. The story of Noah and the ark is a story about a flood, undoubtedly so, yes it is. But it is so much more than that. It's a story about the change wrought in the heart of God. It is a story about a new creation and a new covenant, a story of a God who desires to bring harmony back to a creation that is so out of tune to sing grace that it breaks God's heart in half. That's what it's a story about. While we know the elements of the story well, we are challenged to find again the rainbow connection that ties us to a God who would blot out his own creation and then promise life once again to one person of faithfulness, just one, and then to a bow in the sky, as he puts it, marking a covenant of all creation and of all time. Yeah, we are connected. The covenant of God in Noah's Ark story speaks of God's character. The covenant gives the opportunity for life from death. And the covenant connects us to God, and it connects us to all of creation for all time. Now, whether you choose to take this story as literal, or as allegorical, as history, or as parable, that's your prerogative. But no matter how it is read, it is a story that tells us about the character of God. And God's story is different than others. The story of the flood is a shared text, many of you may know. The story of the flood happens in a lot of other traditions of the Near Middle East, happens in Babylonia, for example. Now, our faith tradition, then, is not alone in telling the story of a great flood and of a person. But there is a difference between how the Israelites, our predecessors, told it, and how others in the Near Middle East told it. And that difference lies not in the flood, not in the ark. That difference lies in God, who God is. Israel's God had a heart that was broken. That was the difference in Israel's God and other gods. Because imagine that you are a brilliant creator, that you're an inventor with an imagination that creates really good and really beautiful things. Your creations are equally brilliant. They can interact and mingle. They have intelligence and they have ability, these creations of yours. They're awesome. They're good. Now imagine that in your good creation, something, though, has gone wrong. Very, very, very wrong. Imagine that which you intended for such good and harmony becomes very individualistic and individualized and so out of tune and out of sync with creation that it is so broken beyond repair. This creation becomes, as the Bible tells us in a word, the worst of things. Violent. The character of God in this story, through that lens, to me, isn't that hard to understand. Not that hard for me, as a mere human, to empathize with. What God created out of the love of God's own heart in creation became something that broke God's heart. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever felt not angry with something that you created or someone you love, not angry at it, but much, much more heartbroken because of what has happened? The flood story is a narrative not about a vengeful, wrathful, destructive, violent God who loves to destroy, but of a God who is an incredibly troubled parent, grieving over the alienation of his creation. God is not angry. God is beyond heartbroken. From God's heartbrokenness comes a radical resolution. From God's heart comes a radical way to fashion newness for all of creation, for all of time. In the story, God's heart found one who was faithfully after it. One. It was Noah. Noah, a bearer of an alternative possibility. Noah. One. Noah, the possibility of a new start, a new way of doing things from here on out. Noah. One. And yes, God has the freedom to find new ways of doing things. God is unchangeable and awesome and good. But God has the ability to find new ways of changing and doing things, does He not? God has the ability to find new ways to do things for His creation. So He found one in Noah, the faithful one. And it only takes one. So Noah went, and Noah did, and Noah, through one, came the blessing of many. Of many, of the lovers, of the dreamers, and even of me. But God was not done yet. God, who has proven powerful enough to be creator of all and destroyer of all, created this promise in the sky. God's new creation has been marked by light that makes its way through water, and then it creates this thing we humans call beautiful in a rainbow. A rainbow was an enduring covenant for all creation. Someday we'll find it, the rainbow connection, the lovers, the dreamers, and me. As we pass through the poured out waters, isn't that something in baptism, the poured out waters? And if the light was just right in here, with the sunshine shining a certain way, we could maybe even see a rainbow on the other side as we pour out the waters of baptism. Isn't that something? As we pass through the waters of baptism, the poured out waters, we remember covenant. It is rich and deep in covenant. We bring to mind the promises of God as water is poured, as water is splashed, as water is baptized. We remember that, whether the story of Noah's Ark is history or whether it is story. It is infallible in its telling of God who has a heart that was broken and then mended through Noah. It tells of a heart of God that grieves and breaks when humanity turns violent, and then a heart that recreates and makes all things new. A heart that makes its promise with every color of the rainbow. It did it then, and you have got to believe it still does it now. As we pass through the poured out waters of baptism, we remember that in God's eyes, it only takes one to create and fashion something that is brand new. It only takes one. As we pass through the poured out waters of baptism, hoping and praying that this Noah, this one right here, might be more faithful, might be more peaceful, might be more than we are. He who comes after us. That's our hope. As we pass through the waters of baptism, we remember our own baptism in a way. Even if you don't remember it, you remember it. As we pass through the waters of baptism, from now with great hope, we remember our own past and we see it come down, and we are hopeful for a new future, one with a rainbow marking the way. As we pass through the waters of baptism, we remember that future hope, the future from now, depends on a move from God. So when this world is too much, too violent, too painful, too selfish, we are reminded that we shall look to God for our hope. We look for God, God of the flood, God of the rainbow. As we pass through the poured out waters of baptism, we pass with the knowledge that God will stay with us. God will stick with even us. that God will endure with us, that God will sustain the world just as he has promised, because he promised it with a covenant. All those years later, after the flood, after the rainbow, after all who came, Jesus stood in a room on that first day, and he stood there, and I know it was silent. The disbelief, the unbelievable, it can't be him with us. And they just stared at each other. It was silent until he spoke 4 simple words. Peace be with you. The God of creation, the God of the Rainbow Covenant, and the Father of Jesus brings you sustaining peace. And he does it with a symbol in the sky. Someday we'll find it, the rainbow connection, the lovers, the dreamers, and me. I know we found it. We found the rainbow connection. And it links together for all time the lovers, the dreamers, God, and yeah, even you. Amen. In our worship, we come to a time of response, and we respond with the giving of our offerings and inclusion in those. If you have any prayers you want to lift up during that time, write it down. And then I would ask if our ushers would come forward.